There is often discussion of the horrors that enslaved people were put through during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as well as the oppression faced by their ancestors in the years following. But to truly understand the devastation of slavery in the supposed New World, we can't just concern ourselves with what happened in the West. We have to remember how they came here and where they came from. We have to remember the Middle Passage. If we backtrack across the Atlantic, we see where it begins. A lot of children are brought up with the idea that Africa was a land void of civilization and African people the same. However, history tells us blatantly that that is not true. An account from Salim Aga, an enslaved man originally from Central Africa, gives us a different look. He describes a country divided into a number of small principalities, and recalls his own valley as having 3 chiefs, one who ruled the center region, and 2 princes on the other side. With the presence of multiple developed civilizations in close proximity comes conflicts, like war and crime. One man, Omar ibn Said, once of the Fula people, was sold by his people because he was found guilty of a crime. Another, Kasula, or Cudjoe Lewis, was interviewed by Zora Neale Hurston and had his story preserved in a work of hers titled Barracoon. Most enslaved people lived within a few hundred miles of the western coast, and this applied to Kasula. He was asleep when his people were attacked by Dahomean warriors, and when he tried to make his escape, he was captured, along with his king. He and the other captured were made to walk for 3 days to the coast. Along the way, Lewis tells, he saw his king decapitated, and his head kept by the soldier who did it. There were multiple other decapitations along the way, and Lewis recalled that the smell made him sick. When they arrived on the coast, they were forced to stay in barracoons, stone, windowless holding cells that could hold up to 200 people. When Kasala was loaded onto the Clotilda, the ship that would take him across the ocean, which he had never seen up until this point, he found a friend of his. Though briefly pleased to see a familiar face, Kasala and his friend were forced to remove their clothes. They arrived in America naked, he said, and were called savages. Vaguer descriptions of the Middle Passage tell us that slaves were often tied down, sometimes stacked, to preserve space in a ship. It was a gamble for slave traders. Less people meant less casualties and less profit lost, and more people meant more casualties, but more potential profit gained. In this way, enslaved people were treated not as people, but as true cargo. The death of a slave was a number, not the loss of a human life. Kasala's recounting of the Middle Passage adds to its notoriety. He describes being given water only twice a day, and it was always mixed with vinegar to prevent scurvy. He became seasick from the constant turbulence. He was kept below deck for 13 days before being brought into daylight to walk around the deck, and he was so weak he could not stand by himself. When they arrived on American soil, Kasala and the others were forced to hide in a swamp for several days before finally arriving in Mobile, Alabama. Aga, Said, and Lewis all have further stories to tell of the challenges they faced once in America, some as horrible and disturbing as the tales of how they arrived, others with better endings. As a latecomer and illegally traded slave, Lewis lived through the abolition of slavery. He went on to buy his own land and establish Africatown, a self-sustaining haven for native African people forced to come to America. But he never forgot what he went through on his way, not even 60 years later during his interviews with Hurston. To understand this unsettling piece of American history is to remind yourself that we must never let people be treated like anything less than people, let alone cargo. This video was made possible by documenting the American South, the Abolition Project, Olegba Folklore Society, and a grant from Partners in the Arts. Thank you for listening.